Okay, welcome back, and this is going to be our final quarterly report for 1850. And the late summer has been interesting. It's been a bit more eventful than much of the rest of this year. We're starting to kind of experience some pressures now, particularly in the outer fringes of the empire, and it's to be expected. We've had a kind of fairly sort of peaceful year, a pretty quiet and comfortable beginning. And this is the Ottoman Empire in the mid-19th century, so we knew that problems would emerge at some point. I'll go through them sort of step by step, I suppose. They're kind of military in character. So the first issue that we have is we started receiving reports about a month or 6 weeks ago that Yemeni tribesmen have armed themselves and are besieging Sana'a, and also our coastal fortress on the Red Sea. We also have an anchorage here. Now, the Ottoman Empire has had a kind of military presence in Sana'a periodically since the mid-16th century, since the times of Suleiman the Magnificent, and it was, I suppose, somewhat inevitable that our withdrawal of a division, which we ultimately relocated to Tripoli, just over here, was likely to encourage locals to become a bit more aggressive, and that has happened. Now, I was sort of rather on the fence. The locals essentially control the territory around both Sana'a and our fortress at Hodeida, and they are besieging both of these locations. In each location, we only have one battalion, basically. It's a garrison battalion of 400 men apiece in Hodeida and in Sana'a. And these forces won't hold on forever, and they've been besieged there for a month now. They have some supplies. They're not sort of out of supplies or anything yet, but there's a good chance that at some point, their sort of situation will become compromised. I was on the fence about what to do. I had mentioned earlier in the year that I had no intention of becoming embroiled in any kind of protracted colonial conflict on the Arabian Peninsula, and that still stands. However, Khurshid Pasha's cavalry division was sitting in Damascus, and it occurred to me that instead of marching all the way through the Hejaz down towards Aden, that actually I could just embark on this port here at Akbar and just use riverine transports to locate him quite quickly to the southern sort of tip of the Arabian Peninsula and intervene. Now, Khurshid Pasha is going to bring a cavalry division of about 5,000 men. It's going to be a surge, if you like. It's going to be a very limited intervention. The intention is really to lift the siege on both the colonial fort and on Sana'a itself. Best case scenario, Khurshid Pasha is able to kind of engage these tribal forces in pitched battle and completely decimates them and kind of ends any security threat to our holdings here. And our concern also is that we're trying to develop our presence a little bit in Yemen, through the development of a trade post. We've sent colonial merchants also to Makalla, where there's opium located here, and we intend to build a trade post here soon when manufactured goods allow for that. So best case scenario, this is what happens. If not, at the very least, I'm hoping that he'll be able to engage these forces, give them a bit of a bloody nose, give them pause for thought, and just buy us a little bit of time, really. I don't want him to be involved in any kind of protracted conflict here. The idea is that his force will be very much on the clock. I'm going to make a limited intervention. We'll keep him here to, say, late December, maybe January next year, and then pull him back. Because in the last analysis, maintaining the security of Palestine and Syria is much more important. These areas are already colonized. We don't want any kind of like large revolt developing here, and we now have nothing here whatsoever, of course. Now, we could, in an emergency scenario, move Hussein Avni into this area, although as you can probably imagine, the area between Syria and the Tigris-Euphrates is quite undeveloped, so this is not going to be any kind of rapid relocation, and this is not a cavalry force that Hussein Avni controls. So the idea is we're going to hope that nothing develops here in the next few months. So that's the security situation that's kind of developing a little bit in Yemen. This is not any kind of threat to the Empire's security in the last analysis. There's a little bit of prestige attached to this, and also, once these kind of these garrisons eventually become destroyed, the likelihood is that these Yemeni columns, are going to head south and begin to interrupt our sort of merchant operations, which ends up, it just means that we're going to be sinking kind of private capital and manufactured goods into something that's completely futile, which we don't want to do. We always expected that this might happen at some point, but I decided actually to sort of to intervene on this occasion, try and do something about it. Now the other development is that a month ago, at the beginning of August, I realized that I had enough state revenue. I had about 420 state revenue. I had a spare diplomat, and I checked to see if it was possible, and the opportunity presented itself that I could colonize Libya quite early. Now, there are real concrete advantages to that, beyond the material advantage of once the colonization is successful, any kind of wealth that exists here amongst the ruling class tops up our private capital. Any kind of revenue that's been generated in Libya that the tribesmen hold, that becomes subsumed into our kind of state revenue. We also accumulate some sort of stockpile of resources, depending on what the inventory of resources that exists here. It also serves to pacify this region to some extent. Now, even if it's a formal colony, this is going to be an area that's subject to insurgencies. Obviously, the kind of interior hasn't really been explored. We only really control the northern coastal area of Libya. So this is going to be an area of sort of continuous incursions from the interior. In any case, this failed. My attempt at colonization failed. Now, in the last video, which was in June, I mentioned that there was a Prussian mission that was being built here in Tobruk. This was built successfully during the sort of transitional phase where I was looking to transform Libya into a colony. It gave the Prussians a much greater degree of colonial penetration than I anticipated. 27% is very good, and it led to about a 5 to 10% atrophying of our own penetration in this particular province. Now, this unfortunately served to bring the average colonial penetration of this colony just below the threshold of what is required to transform it into a colony, which essentially meant that my attempt failed. But the cost that I sunk into that was lost. The money, the outlay, which covers lots of different things. It covers the development or the preparation of a proper direct colonial administration for the province, which is currently a protectorate. You send a diplomat. A lot of this money kind of greases the diplomatic wheels to get the kind of concert of powers, the other powers, to formally recognize that this is now, an integral part of the Ottoman Empire. This money is lost. You don't get this money back, basically. There's no way of recouping the cost. And it's a lot. 375 state revenue is the cost to try and transform a protectorate into a colony. So it's a real slip up on our part. I've taken some measures to try and recoup this cost. Now, first of all, we've sent a mission to sort of the Alagala sort of shoulder, or Sirte, if you like. We've also, because of this drop in average colonial penetration, we've started a bribing operation in the interior of Cyrenaica, and we're going to develop this a little bit more across the entire colony. We now want to we're going to look to basically replicate what we've done this year, except we intend not to fail next year. The idea is to bring average colonial penetration high enough that we can kind of transform this into a colony early on. It's worth doing early on. This will pay dividends in the long run, because as a protectorate, it's much less stable. There's much more of a question mark over whether this is our territory. Whilst it's a protectorate, it's also going to invite things like this, sort of foreigners kind of turning up, Prussians, Brits, Italians, French, who might be interested in sort of trying to develop a little bit of colonial penetration in a region which is, already sort of nominally ours to a large extent. It's already a protectorate. So it's just, the purpose of full colonization is to sort of discourage further foreign involvement, and also to pacify the region a little bit, make it less likely to sort of be subject to revolts and this sort of thing. Now, it was subject to revolt when the attempt at colonization failed. A revolt was triggered in Tripoli. Now, we had already moved a division. In fact, this is the division we originally brought up from Aden, which has taken pretty much the entire year to get to Tripoli. And we engaged the rebels in Tripoli in 2 separate engagements. I think the first engagement lasted 2 rounds, so it's a 2-hour combat. Our losses were fairly negligible. We lost just under 1,000 men. These are our first casualties of the game. And we killed 1,600 of theirs, or I say we killed, that's their overall casualties. Many of these we can see were prisoners. The remaining force was destroyed. By the looks of it, they simply surrendered. There were only 400 men left. So this revolt was very, very quickly suppressed, brutally and ruthlessly put down. But yeah, a real shame. I mean, like this was a huge kind of a huge amount of money, frankly, thrown away, and we have a pretty small economy, and we don't have a huge amount of state revenue. The amount of money that we spent attempting to convert this province into a colony is something like six to 9 months worth of our entire tax revenue. Now, to try and offset that a little bit, we now have a constant trickle of gems from Qatar, Dubai, and Bahrain. We now have trade posts set up, and if we look at our inventory, we actually have 5 gems stockpiled already. Now, what I've decided to do is to try and minimize the amount of gems that are likely to be sold on the domestic market. I've tried to drive this down to about 25% availability. It means that these goods are much more likely to be converted into state revenue. So we're hoping that over a year or so, that'll mitigate the kind of daft sort of loss that we experienced over the last month or so, really, in a sort of failed attempt to colonize Libya. So that's it. There are no other kind of security concerns, no other significant security developments, but we can certainly say that the really sort of comfortable start that we had in this year has kind of drawn to a close. We are now engaging insurgents and rebels, if not on the fringes of the empire, anyway. And certainly, this was quite an upsetting experience not to have achieved colonization of Libya this year. But we're going to push for it again next year. And once this becomes a formal colony, we do get a very a fairly significant short-term boost in the amount of state revenue that we have, because we sort of absorb the wealth of this territory formally. In terms of our economy, things are really, really kicking off. So the first RGO that we started building, I think, was it back in March? That's now finished. So this is our first capitalist enterprise built and completed just outside Constantinople. It's a cereal farm. Its output is 2 cereals every sort of fortnight. Still at a fairly low level of productivity. We don't have railroads. We don't have the technological capacity just yet to build railroads. And the fisherman's port that we're building here also is almost complete. Possibly, I think it'll be complete either by the end of this month or sometime in October. Our kind of agricultural expansion then is extended to Adrianople. We've got a tobacco plantation and a cereals farm being built there, likely to be finished by the end of this year. I think this tobacco plantation will be. A further tobacco plantation is being developed in Kavala, and in Salonika we've got a fisherman's port and a cereals farm being built there. We also have actually a fisherman's port being built in Smyrna and a cereal farm in northern Bulgaria and Plevna. So these are investments. These will start really kind of yielding results. I think next year we'll start seeing more concrete results in terms of the sort of stocks that we have of these particular commodities, and we'll hope that this will have an impact on our exports. Our exports have remained really solid. Timber every turn. We're now exporting some iron. Our craftsmen produce a small amount of iron. The only kind of resource that I'm really stockpiling at the moment, sort of industrial resource, is coal. One of the reasons for that is that sometimes sort of the industrial development throughout the world can begin to outstrip coal supply. This happens in fits and bursts. Coal supply then begins to catch up. But the idea is that once we begin our kind of industrial expansion, maybe in a few years from now, it'll be nice to have a large stockpile of coal to fall back on, because we only have really a small amount of craftsman production of coal. We don't actually have any coal mining or proper capitalist coal mining operations developed yet. We obviously intend to do this quite quickly, but if we have a large stockpile of coal that we can start kind of eating into, this will buy us quite a bit of time with regard to developing proper indigenous kind of coal mining capacity. We're exporting iron, chemicals, nitrates now, fruits, fish, and cereals. We're buying a small amount of military supplies from the United States. This is because we don't really have a proper industrial military complex just yet, so we want to make sure that we kind of keep our supplies stockpiled, that we don't have any issues if a sudden conflict breaks out. We want to make sure that we have enough supplies stockpiled on the map, and that we've got a constant trickle of supplies that are being converted into stockpiles that sit on the map. I think that's quite important. That we, this is not a kind of a measure that we're going to take it once a war begins, because it may very well be the case that then we don't have access to any kind of supplies. So exports remain good. National market sales, in terms of Overall numbers of commodities dropped ever so slightly, but actually they're yielding slightly more in terms of price. Exports remain strong, as I say. We've bought in 15, 5 merchandises at a cost of 15. So a good year economically, and things are developing well there. In terms of our colonial operations, I don't think there's much more beyond what I already mentioned. In the immediate aftermath of the failure to colonize Libya, we sent a mission. In fact, I think I mentioned this to Ali Gala, and we're attempting a bribing operation for chiefs in the interior. We're going to try and develop that a little bit more. We want to try and build ourselves a stronger base amongst the kind of the tribal leaders in Libya, so that we don't experience the same kind of foul up that we had in the last month. As I've mentioned also, we intend eventually to, before this colonial merchant runs out in 11 terms, we want to try and get a trade station permanently built in Mukalla. And as I've mentioned already, actually, in terms of Qatar, Bahrain and Dubai, we've got a really good merchant operation now. These trade posts, I mean, the colonial merchants that are still there provide a constant trickle of private capital for us, and we're now getting a kind of pretty much constant trickle of gems every fortnight into our economy. That is it. I don't think there's anything else to report. I should point out that on the diplomatic front, throughout the year, we have sort of reached out to a few powers without any kind of great results. Now, the fact that we've kind of set our tax sliders to be quite protectionist does lead to a little bit of a kind of atrophying of relations with other powers. This is something that's very, very gradual, but certainly the great powers don't like heavily protectionist economies because, of course, you know, their interest is to export to us and to sort of try and dominate our domestic market. This is something that we're not interested in. We want to make sure that we've got fairly strong tariffs in place that sort of stimulates our own economic development. We've tried to offset that a little bit by sending merchants to the UK to try and organise a state visit. This was rebuffed, unfortunately. We'll try again when sort of opportunity presents itself. In terms of the Balkan Peninsula, since the 1820s at least, really, we've now kind of lost control of these principalities completely. And Montenegro, Serbia, Wallachia and Moldova, these principalities are now completely independent. It was once the case that they were kind of nominally independent, but they were puppets of ours. We actually have quite good diplomatic relations with them still. And we intend to develop those relations a little bit, especially with Montenegro and Serbia. These territories are lost to the empire. We're not going to control these territories again. You know, that ship has sailed after the Congress of Berlin, I think the 1820s. You know, these principalities are recognized by the concert of powers as being independent. And certainly Serbia doesn't have any huge interest in us sort of controlling huge parts of the Balkans. Nevertheless, we have good diplomatic relations, and if we can't, if we can't politically control them anymore, militarily control them, the idea is that we can maybe begin to economically dominate them. Once we develop a strong capitalist base, we can become a sort of a kind of an economic patron to these powers, and we can try and develop sort of commercial relationships with them and this kind of thing, and try and stop them falling into the orbit of Russia. The only other development in the Balkan Peninsula, as you can see here, is the Austrians have deployed a pretty large force just to the north of Bosnia. We don't have too much information on the character of this force. We can see that it's fairly large. It contains 3 regular infantry formations. We don't know what size. At a guess, I would imagine they're probably corps size. Probably 3 cavalry divisions and 2 supply trains. We don't know why this has been deployed here. We're hoping this is just going to be a routine sort of presence in southern Hungary. But we have to sort of keep in mind that is there. And draw conclusions from that. We'll see what happens. Hopefully this means nothing. It might mean everything. Time will tell. I think in the event of an Austrian invasion of Bosnia, our plan would be in the short term to keep our force quite far back to begin with, to see how it develops. We don't want to move our main imperial army all the way up to Zvornik, which is quite difficult to supply here. It would take it probably a month for our force to get here, and this then leaves Constantinople quite vulnerable to the Russians if they move down through Silistria. So I'll end our last quarterly report there, and next update will be the 1st of January 1851, and that'll be our first year out of the way. So hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time.